Lecture 4, Liberalism in Dispute.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is my last lecture about liberalism. Let me just explain to you the context. Last time I offered an overview of liberalism and also discussed some of the divisions between, on the one side, classical liberalism and on the other, welfare liberalism, in respect, on the one side, of their views of the state and their views of liberty. What we were concerned with here relates to what is really a big divide in US politics, one which also stands behind many important divisions between conservatives and liberals in the US, but it's also a divide that you'll find in many other Western societies too. Today, in this lecture now, we're going to do something a bit different. We're going to explore why people take the views that they do with regard to these matters. We're going to look at some of the arguments between them, and then we're going to do something slightly different at the end. On the one side, to kind of take the big picture view of liberalism and to explore 4 different interpretations of what liberalism may look like from the outside, from a distance. And then also what we're going to do is to see what things look like radically from the outside. For example, what conservatives would make of liberalism and some of the kinds of points and issues that they might highlight, but which liberals themselves wouldn't. Let me then make a start. What really is at issue between classical and welfare liberals? There seem to me to be 2 main sources of disagreements. On the one side, issues about rights and obligations. Who, as it were, owes what to whom? And on the other, their arguments and disagreements about how the world, including government, functions. Let me take these issues in turn. First of all, there's rights and obligations. In general terms, if someone has a right to something, others typically have corresponding obligations. For example, if I have a right to walk across a particular field, then that means that other people are obliged to leave me alone. They shouldn't interfere with me if I got a right to walk across the field. Similarly, if I own a bicycle, it means that other people shouldn't use it other than with my permission. The idea is reasonably straightforward. I have certain rights. If I have those rights, other people have got certain kinds of obligations. One might then ask, what is involved by way of rights and the corresponding obligations in the ideal of positive liberty? No liberal, not a classical liberal, not a welfare liberal, would deny that autonomy and so on are good for people, that it's useful that people should have resources and so on, that these are good things for people to have. But typically, if it's claimed that people have a right to these things, classical liberals will ask, just who is obliged to furnish these things to the other people, to the people who've got the right, and why? That's to say, the classical liberal will typically say it would be nice if people had these things, but they'll contest the idea that they have them as a right, often by arguing that it's just not clear that other people, other members of the population, are obliged to provide those things to them. They may have other things that are for them more morally pressing, more morally important. And they'd simply deny that other people are entitled, as it were, to demand that they be furnished with what they need for these positive rights, in the same kind of way as we can demand that if someone has got the right to walk across the field, that other people should leave them alone. There has, as you can imagine on these matters, been much academic argument back and forth. For example, on the welfare liberal side, the American philosopher John Rawls has offered powerful arguments for welfare liberalism. For example, by asking us to imagine what kind of social arrangements would people agree to if they didn't know what position they were going to hold within a society. You might say, suppose we're in a situation where we just didn't know whether in a society we were going to be talented or very much more modest in our accomplishments. If we were going to be crippled, or really fit, if other people were going to find us attractive, and so on. If you just didn't know these things, wouldn't you say you need certain kinds of welfare guarantees built in? And so his argument is really that these sorts of considerations should incline us towards the welfare perspective. Alternatively, one might argue that if we favour autonomy, if we favour well-being and flourishing, if we favour liberty, then what we have to consider is what, as a matter of fact, is the best way of encouraging these things. And this leads us away from issues about obligation and so on, to issues more about how the world works, how things function. Here, the classical liberal will typically argue things by and large work best if people take decisions for themselves, if they make use of market mechanisms, if they rely where they need help on the family, if they make use of voluntary associations, if people get into groups for the purposes of mutual aid, if others need a hand, give them donations from a charitable perspective. The welfare liberal will say, okay, these things are all very well, we're liberals too, we don't disagree with this, but they don't ensure that everyone gets what they need. Further, the welfare liberal will say, surely we found in the 1930s and so on in the Great Depression that sometimes government action is essential to sort things out. The classical liberal, in turn, has a response. He'll say, look, we'll accept government action where it's necessary, where it's absolutely necessary, but we're really worried about government and we're really cautious about when government should be brought in. Why? Well, from our perspective, there are three big problems about government. First of all, its powers are, at bottom, coercive. That's to say, there's surely going to be some things where we really don't want to get it involved. Take the example that I was giving in the last lecture about my being overweight. I think I would agree, and probably everyone would agree, that not only would it be more aesthetic if I didn't weigh as much as I did, but it would be good for me. And also there's a sense in which, if I'm really a bit out of control when eating hamburgers or Lindt chocolate or something of this kind, there's a sense in which my freedom is a bit compromised. And there's a sense in which, I think, we're kind of worried about having this sort of father or mother-like figure in government, exercising paternalistic control over our conduct. And I think, by and large, our reaction is going to be that even if the result might be something that we'd favour, we'd be very leery of having government in, sort of treating us like a kid. A second kind of argument really relates to the limitations of our knowledge. What do I mean by this? Well, there are all kinds of things where somehow it would be nice if they could be sorted out. There are problems, for example, about dysfunctional families, about people growing up in disadvantage and so on, where somehow if someone could wave a magic wand and sort the problem out, I guess we'd be really pretty happy about it. But there's a sense in which also with regard to these kinds of matters, I think that we probably have to say that in many cases we haven't the faintest idea quite what can best be done about them. And in that context, you might say, look, if our knowledge is uncertain, if we can't be sure about things, it's probably best that we don't have government in there, but rather that we allow for voluntary initiatives, allowing scope for experimentation and learning of a kind which it's somehow rather difficult to get in the case of government programs. That quite often it seems as if once you've got the program in place, then it's sort of locked in place, and it's rather difficult to get the government department to admit that it's not really doing things quite right. The third kind of concern that the classical liberal may raise relates to how government operates. In particular, they would say that government doesn't just do what we want or what welfare liberals want. Rather, government responds to lobby groups, government responds to the interests of those whom it employs and so on, rather than necessarily to our view about what it ought to be doing. And so the argument here is that even if government could do stuff, one has to be a little bit careful about invoking it. To this, in turn, welfare liberals respond, look, there have been problems that the government did address. and where there was no sign of our being able to do so by other means. Take the civil rights movement and the response made in the end by government to that. Take the issue, say, of racial equality in the armed forces, where it looked certainly as if the government in these cases did, albeit in certain cases belatedly, come in almost like a fairy with a magic wand and do things which